Have you ever wondered what would happen if two of the most legendary warrior cultures in history clashed? The mighty Roman Empire versus the fierce Vikings? It's a matchup for the ages, a battle that never happened in reality, but one that sparks endless debate. Who would actually emerge victorious from this colossal confrontation? To figure this out, we need to dive deep into their military strategies, their equipment, and the very mindset that made them so formidable. Let's set the stage. We aren't just talking about any Romans or any Vikings. We are pitting the Roman legions at their absolute peak. Around 117 AD, under Emperor Trajan, against the Vikings during the height of their raiding era, roughly from the 9th to the 11th century. This means we're comparing the most disciplined, professional army of the ancient world with the most feared raiders of the early medieval period. It's a classic clash of styles, organized military power versus ferocious, unpredictable warriors. First, let's look at the Roman war machine. The heart of the Roman army was the legionary, a professional soldier who signed up for 25 years of service. This wasn't a part-time job. It was their entire life. These soldiers were supremely trained and incredibly disciplined. They could march for miles carrying over 60 pounds of gear, build fortified camps every single night, and execute complex battlefield maneuvers with precision. Roman commanders could rely on their troops to hold the line, follow orders without question, and adapt to changing circumstances. A standard Roman legion was a force of nearly 5,000 men, a self-contained army equipped with its own engineers, artillery, and logistical support. The Romans didn't just fight, engineered the battlefield to their advantage, building bridges, siege engines, and roads. Their discipline was legendary. A Roman century, a unit of about 80 men, fought and lived together. This created an unbreakable bond and a sense of collective responsibility. The concept of decimation, where 1 in every 10 soldiers in a failing unit was executed by their own comrades, shows the extreme lengths they went to enforce order. And let's turn our attention to the Vikings. The term Viking itself describes an activity, not a people. These were Norsemen farmers, traders, and explorers who went a Viking or raiding. They were not a standing professional army like the Romans. Their strength lay in their ferocity, their individual combat prowess, and their element of surprise. Viking warriors were raised in a harsh environment where fighting skill was highly valued. From a young age, they learned to handle axes, swords, and spears. A typical Viking force was much smaller than a Roman legion, often just a few hundred men packed into their iconic longships. These ships were technological marvels of their time. Their shallow draft allowed them to navigate not only open seas, but also shallow rivers, enabling them to strike deep inland where no one expected an attack. The Vikings were masters of the hit-and-run raid, would appear suddenly, strike with terrifying speed and brutality, then vanish with their plunder before a proper defense could be mounted. Their goal was usually wealth, not territorial conquest in the Roman sense. Let's compare their gear. A Roman legionary was a walking fortress. He wore a larica segmentata, armor made of overlapping iron plates, which offered excellent protection. On his head was a galea, a bronze or iron helmet that protected his head, neck, and cheeks. His primary weapon was the gladius, a short, double-edged sword designed for stabbing and slashing in the tight confines of a shield wall. Before closing in, he would hurl a pilum, a heavy javelin engineered to bend upon impact, making it impossible to pull out of a shield and throw back. The legionary's most important piece of equipment, however, was his large rectangular shield, the scutum. When locked together, these shields formed the famous testudo, or tortoise formation, an impenetrable shell of shields that could protect the legionaries from a hailstorm of arrows and other projectiles. The Viking warrior's equipment was more varied. A wealthy Viking might wear a chainmail shirt, known as a byrnie, and an iron helmet. However, many raiders would have gone into battle with little more than a hardened leather tunic, their shield, and their courage. Their primary defensive tool was their round wooden shield. Unlike the Roman scutum, which was used as part of a collective wall, the Viking shield was a more dynamic tool, used for parrying, blocking, and even punching in one-on-one combat. When it came to weapons, the Vikings had a fearsome arsenal. While swords were a status symbol, the most iconic Viking weapon was the Dane axe. This long-handled axe could cleave through a shield and a helmet with a single devastating blow. It required strength and space to wield effectively, but in the hands of a skilled warrior, it was terrifying. So, how would the battle play out? It really depends on where and how they fight. Let's imagine a scenario. A pitched battle on an open plain, the kind of fight the Romans excelled at. The Roman legion would advance in its disciplined formations, a silent, glittering wall of steel and shields. The centurions would be barking orders, keeping the lines perfectly dressed. On the other side, the Vikings would be a stark contrast, a roaring, chaotic-looking mass of warriors, beating their shields and shouting challenges. As the Vikings charge, a wave of noise and fury, the Romans would stand firm. The first thing the Vikings would encounter is a volley of thousands of pila. A 2017 study simulating the impact of the pilum confirmed its design was incredibly effective at disabling shields, punching through the wood and bending, making the shield heavy and useless. Imagine hundreds of Viking warriors having to discard their primary defense right before impact. This would disrupt their charge and create openings in their shield wall. The psychological impact of this perfectly timed volley would be immense. As the two lines crashed together, the Roman training would take over. They would not engage in heroic individual duels. Instead, they would use their scutum to punch and create openings. Then deliver a quick, efficient stab with the gladius from behind the safety of their shield wall. The Roman method was a meat grinder, designed to minimize their own casualties while systematically destroying the enemy. The Vikings' ferocious charge and the power of their Dane axes would certainly cause casualties. An axe could splinter a scutum and break the Roman line in localized spots. But the Roman army was designed to handle this. The second and third lines of legionaries would plug any gaps, and centurions would be there to restore order. The sheer number of soldiers in a legion, their discipline, and their ability to rotate fresh troops to the front line would likely wear the Vikings down. In an open field battle, the odds are overwhelmingly in favor of the Romans. But what if the battle took place on the Vikings' terms? Imagine a Viking fleet sailing up a river in Gaul or Britain and disembarking for a raid. The terrain is forested and hilly, not an open plain. Here the situation changes dramatically. The large, rigid Roman formations would struggle to maneuver effectively. The Vikings, accustomed to fighting in smaller, more flexible groups, would use the terrain to their advantage. They would employ ambushes, hiding in the trees and striking the Roman column from the flanks and rear. In this kind of guerrilla warfare, the individual fighting skill of the Viking warrior comes to the fore. A one-on-one fight between a legionary and a Viking berserker would be a terrifying spectacle. The Romans' training is based on formation fighting. Our Vikings is based on individual survival and brutal efficiency. The Vikings' longships also give them a massive strategic advantage in mobility. They could raid a coastal settlement and be gone before the local Roman legion, which might be stationed days away, could even respond. The Romans were land-based. Their navy was primarily for transport and combating pirates, not for projecting power upriver like the Vikings could. Let's also consider leadership. Roman generals were often politicians, but the best of them, like Caesar or Trajan, were brilliant strategists and logicians. They thought in terms of campaigns, supply lines, and long-term objectives. Viking leaders were chieftains who led from the front. Their authority came from their personal bravery, their success in battle, and their ability to reward their followers with plunder. They were inspirational warriors, but not necessarily grand strategists in the Roman sense. So, who is the ultimate winner? If a full Roman legion at its peak could force a large Viking army into a decisive, open-field battle, the Romans would almost certainly win. Their discipline, organization, superior armor, and formation fighting tactics are tailor-made to counter the Vikings' ferocious but less organized charge. The number of soldiers involved would also be a deciding factor. However, if we are talking about a war of raids and ambushes fought in the dense forests and along the winding rivers of northern Europe, the Vikings would have a significant edge. Their superior mobility, knowledge of the terrain, and guerrilla tactics would bleed the Romans dry. The Romans would be trying to swat a swarm of deadly hornets with a sledgehammer. Ultimately, it's a clash of military philosophies. The Romans represented centralized power, professionalization, and engineered warfare. The Vikings represented decentralized, opportunistic warfare driven by individual prowess and the pursuit of plunder. Neither side is definitively better. They were just masters of their own. very different styles of war. The winner of any single engagement would depend entirely on the circumstances. But the fact that we are still talking about them today proves that both the Romans and the Vikings were, in their own right, two of the most successful and feared warrior cultures the world has ever seen. What do you think? Who would have the upper hand? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And for more deep dives into history's greatest what-ifs, make sure to subscribe to Historical Repo.